The Bible never says where Jesus fled to, but it's pretty clear. I think it's quite sure that he went to Alexandria. Cairo was just a small village. Alexandria was where the action was. So he would have gone there with his parents, where his parents could find work. And if he grew up in that town, because he's supposed to have grown up in Egypt, and he was interested in anything spiritual, surely he would have gone to this very famous monastery in Alexandria of the Therapeutae. So he would have had a Buddhist influence there somewhere. Now, according to other legends, they say that he actually went to Kashmir later on in his life. And the evidence for that comes from a count, I believe he was a German-born count, who was trekking in the western part of the Himalaya mountains, in the province of Ladakh. I think this must have been about 1948, 49 or something. I'm not quite sure of the dates there. But he had a fall in the snow, broke his leg, and the only place he could go to recover was the local monastery in the town of Leh. And being holed up there for many weeks, many months as his leg healed, he asked to see the local library in the monastery. You know, he could read Sanskrit. And so he went into that library and he was just looking around for anything interesting. And there he found an ancient document which recorded about 2,000 years ago this monk called Issa, who had come from Palestine and had trained in Kashmir and had gone back to Palestine and been crucified and had survived and gone back to Palestine and spent the rest of back to Kashmir and spent the rest of his life, many, many years, teaching and also healing. He's supposed to have some great powers. And that was what he read in this manuscript. And of course, as soon as he got better, he returned to Europe and he published his work, and all hell broke loose. The idea that Jesus was in Kashmir, that he was influenced by Buddhists, was heretical, as you would obviously understand. So people went back to that monastery to check if that manuscript existed. But unfortunately, this was after 1951, or 53, I forget, when the Chinese invaded Tibet, and the abbot was absent from the monastery. He'd gone into Tibet and hadn't come back. And the second abbot refused to open up the library without the abbot's permission, and so this was a stalemate. And this was like this for many, many years, because I know when I became a monk, I knew this story, and they still hadn't checked whether the manuscript was there or not. But then, after in the late 1970s, they finally realized the abbot was not going to come back. He was dead. He must have died in the Chinese occupation of Tibet. And they decided to appoint another abbot and therefore open up the library. And of course the scholars went in there and the text exists. It's there. So it's true. And then, is it reasonable that such a thing would happen? If a Jesus or an Issa did become interested in Buddhism, because he went to a monastery in Alexandria in Egypt, then it was more than likely he would be sent to the center of Buddhism in that time. And the center of Buddhism 2,000 years ago was in Kashmir. That was where the Buddhist emperor Kanishka, who was one of the most famous of the Buddhist emperors, had his capital. And it was in Kashmir. That was the center of the Indian Empire 2,000 years ago. So he would have gone there. That was the central place for Buddhism. That's where he would have gone. And that's actually what the text says. And of course, there's also the last piece of little evidence is there has been a long-standing tradition that Jesus' body is buried in Kashmir. This Jesus' tomb. And this has been looked after by Muslims for centuries, and the word has gone around this is where this Jesus was buried. That particular area is called Yusuf, which is Yusuf, Jesus. These are all the same words. The words change as you go from country to country, but this is the word. And Yusuf was a very holy man, And he, exactly the same story as was in this little text found in the library of the Buddhist monastery in Leh. And apparently that recently the BBC did a documentary about this, and I saw it on Channel 4 BBC. Actually, I saw it on YouTube. And in that documentary they went to see this ancient tomb, and apparently there's a Muslim saint who's been buried on top of this maybe Jesus. So they can't excavate, they can't dig and find out any archaeological evidence from this tomb or from this box in which Jesus was supposed to be. But an interesting part is that in this very little shrine where Jesus is supposed to have been buried, the only memorial to Jesus, the so-called Jesus, is a metal footprint. And this is supposed to represent this Jesus buried underneath. Number one, the investigators working for the British BBC noticed that no other tradition remembers somebody by their footprints, because in Asia the feet are supposed to be the lowest part of the body, the dirtiest part of the body, and anything respectable is not connected with the feet. And here we have a footprint of this great saint. And as we all know, footprints were one of the signs of the Buddha. You can go to many, many places, and the footprints of the Buddha, real or imaginary, are actually worshipped by the Buddhists. It is a very Buddhist way of remembering somebody. And the other thing which they noticed, that on these footprints there was engraved scars on the feet, which were also quite strange. And they looked and saw, from sort of physiologically, from medicine, that if you were crucified and the nails were put through your feet, that would be the scar which would be on your feet. So they said that's some more circumstantial evidence that that person buried there was actually crucified. So that's the evidence. Circumstantial. One by one, you add them all together, and maybe, there's a chance there that there's something to that story. Maybe Jesus was a Buddhist. And maybe all these people who worship Jesus are just worshipping a great Buddhist monk a long time ago. So maybe the whole of Christianity is just people who worship a great Buddhist monk.